First of all, this reminder of an old story. A story about that proud and arrogant king who made a decree that everyone who came before him would have to kneel and put their heads on the ground. There was an occasion when he arranged a great feast for the populace, and when all were gathered in the grand hall, he entered with pomp and ceremony, and everyone fell to their knees and put their heads on the floor, except one being who stood tall. The king was very angry, and he marched over to this being, and he said, "Only God does not bow down before the king, and nothing is greater than God. Who then are you?" And the being replied, "I am that nothing." And then there's a story about the great King Solomon. Now we know that King Solomon had great powers. He knew the language of the animals and the birds. He had dominion over the elements. And many, many great monarchs came to give their obeisance to him. Included amongst them was the great Queen of Sheba. She brought many gifts to him, and in return King Solomon said, "What gift may I give to you?" And the Queen of Sheba replied, "I would like a palace built out of the beaks of the birds." So King Solomon, drawing himself up to his full height, said, "It shall be done." And with that he put out the call, and the birds began to come. They filled the great hall of his palace. The great eagles, the condors, the sparrows, the tomtits, all of them filling his great palace hall. But then King Solomon said after some time, when the birds had gathered, "Where is the Hoopae bird?" That tiny little bird with the tufts on its head and the long, slender beak. And nobody knew, until finally, later, in flew the Hoopae bird. King Solomon was angry. "Where have you been? I put out the call." The little Hoopae bird answered, "Great monarch, I have not just been flitting around, enjoying the sensory awarenesses. I have seen things. I have had adventures. I have grown wise. But if you want me to bow down to your wishes, I would ask that you answer 3 riddles." Well, all the birds gasped. How could this tiny little bird go up and challenge King Solomon like this? But he didn't get angry. He said, "Ask your riddles." And so the little Hoopae bird said, "What is it that is never born and never dies?" And immediately King Solomon answered, "Why, It is the great power of all things, the creative force. And then the little Hoopae bird asked, since King Solomon had answered his first riddle, what is the water that does not fall from the sky or rise from the earth? And King Solomon replied, why, it's a tear. And with that King Solomon looked around and saw the forlorn bodies and beings of all the birds who had gathered to give up their beaks, and a tear rolled down from his eyes. And now the little Hoopae bird, shaking and trembling, said, you've answered my 2 riddles, and my 3rd riddle is, what is it that can feed a tiny mouth and yet bore into the hardest wood? And King Solomon answered, why, it's a bird's beak. And in that moment King Solomon had a great realization. The little Hoopae bird spoke up and said, the great monarch, you have answered my 3 riddles. Do with me what you will. King Solomon said, we will not build a palace of the beaks of the birds. And of course, all the birds gathered gave out a great sigh of relief. But the Hoopae bird spoke up and said, whilst we no longer need to build a palace with our beaks, we can build a palace of our feathers. The Queen of Sheba was delighted with this thought, and suddenly all the birds flew up and flapped their wings, their feathers floating down, and in a very short space of time they had constructed a palace of feathers such as never been seen before. The Queen of Sheba was greatly delighted with this. But then King Solomon called his jewelers to him and instructed them to make a tiny golden crown. And this golden crown was placed on the head of the Hoopae bird. And this is why all the Hoopae birds until now have a little crown of gold on their heads. But what arises out of this story for us is, what is the realization that King Solomon had after answering these 3 riddles? What is it that we found in this place that we find ourselves? Looking at the first old story, that which bows down to no thing is that no thing. What is the realization that arises out of the story of King Solomon and the Hoopae bird for us.